There. All right. Tonight's class is about what is income for a minister. Let me see if I can share the screen. Okay. There. So obviously salary would be income for the minister. Retirement gifts. We'll talk a little bit more about gifts in a minute, but so there is a special provision in the Internal Revenue Code for retirement gifts, special occasion gifts. If you purchase something that the church owned at less than fair market value, the difference in that, what you purchased it for in the fair market value, would be income to you. Reimbursements paid to you other than those paid under an accountable plan would be income to you. Bonuses. If the church pays their share of Social Security, then their share is income to you. If you use for personal use, you use a church-owned vehicle, then that is income to you. If they loan you money and forgive the debt, that is income to you. If your spouse travels with you and they pay some extra cost for her traveling with you, it's not true generally if you take a car somewhere, but if you go an airplane ride and they bought a ticket for her to go as well as you, her travel expense would be income to you. Possibly health insurance premiums could be income to you, and below market rate loans. And then there's some tax-free fringe benefits that may be income. Housing allowance would be an income issue. The income from the housing allowance is not taxed for income taxes, but would be taxed if you're subject to Social Security Act. Gifts. We'll talk a little more about gifts in a few minutes. Group term life insurance premiums above $50,000. Any scholarships, employer paid health insurance premiums, any tuition reductions, any lodging that's done for their benefit. I've never seen, just as an aside right here, I haven't seen in 40 years a preacher that lives in church-owned housing. Most preachers I know, they buy their own house and the church provides a housing allowance. Educational assistance up to $5,250 a year, and it's been that number for many years. Employer provided child care on a non-discriminatory basis, and de minimis fringe benefits. We'll talk a little bit more about what de minimis fringe benefits are. When I taught this class at Polishing the Pulpit in 2017, I walked into the class And one of the preachers, I shook hands with him, and inside my hand, I had a $50 bill that I transferred to his hand as we were shaking. And he said, I don't need this. I don't get this. And I said, yes, you do. Said it's a gift. So we talked about gifts. And the gifts, the main question is, what is the intent of the donor? So I intended to give him free from everything, with no expectation of repayment, no expectation of anything in return, the $50. Court case from LeBeau said that a gift in the statutory sense proceeds from the detached and disinterested generosity done out of affection, respect, admiration, charity, or like impulses. In this regard, the most critical consideration, as the court agreed in the leading case here, was the transferor's intention. So we had that case, Bogardus versus Commissioner. And what controls, in a Duberstein case, they later decided what controls is the intention with which the payment, however voluntary, has been made. So if the gift is, if the donor intends that it be a gift, it is a gift. Now, in Banks versus Commissioner, held in 1991, the preacher received special occasion gifts, but he did that every year, and they knew they would give him those gifts every year, and they publicized it, and they tried to force not force the membership. They strongly encouraged the membership to make contributions so they could give those special occasion gifts. And in that case, the court held that those gifts to the commission, to the preacher, to the minister, were income. In Godwin versus Commissioner in 1995, special occasion gifts, which accounted for between 50 and 100% of his income, were income to the minister. So there may be the church may say that they're gifts, but the IRS may say that, especially if they're frequently done, or if they're done on a routine basis, the court may say, the IRS may say that they are income to you.
So question.
Okay.
So with that gift, if you do, like you did $50.
Okay.
Okay. He does not have to report that to the IRS, right?
No, he does not, because that was a gift.
Right. Now, what's the difference between the $50 and the $40,000 if they're saying that it's a gift?
The difference, let's go back to the screen there. The difference is the way in which they approached it. I mean, the congregation, the minister, they said that they were gifts, but they did it every year. They did it on his anniversary every year, on Christmas, on special occasions throughout the year. Everything would be a gift to him. They would make gifts to him, and they did it regularly, and every year they did it. So the court says, because you're doing it every year, we can't see that it's a gift.
Okay.
Now, in my case, that's the only time I've ever given that minister a $50 or any money.
Right.
So I gave him a gift.
So
Now,
if it's routinely done, then it's
if
reported
it's,
to the IRS.
yes, if it's routinely done, then that taints the nature of it and has much more likelihood that the IRS would consider it income and not gifts.
Okay.
Now, we had some cases back in 1949, 1954, Shaw, Much, Kavanaugh, and Abernathy cases, retirement gifts made to ministers, including some recurring monthly payments, could possibly be tax-exempt gifts. Now, there's still some weasel words there, but a minister that has spent a long time ministering for a congregation, and then he retires, and then they give him a gift or a series of gifts, it can still be a tax-exempt gift. But just consideration of the length of time he was there, the length of time he worked with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, could be tax-exempt gifts. In section 102C of the Internal Revenue Code, any amount transferred by or for an employer to and for the benefit of an employee cannot be a gift, with the two exceptions of employee achievement awards or de minimis fringe benefits. So if the church gave you something, that couldn't be a gift unless it fell into one of those two exceptions. Now, if a member of the church gave you something, it could be a gift. But if the church as a legal entity gave you something, it could not be a gift. For employee achievement awards to be tax exempt, they must meet the following criteria. They cannot be cash or cash equivalents. You can give somebody an employee achievement award as a gift card and it be tax exempt. They cannot exceed $1,600 in value. They can only be awarded every 5 years. And it must be for a length of service or a safety achievement. So if you gave the preacher something every 5 years, 5 and 10 and 15, 20, if you gave them a gift, and as long as it wasn't cash or cash equivalent, and it was less than $1,600 in value, then that could be non-taxable income to him. I told you, I think I told you that I worked for Bell South for 17 years. This watch that I have was an employee gift from Bell South. And on the back of it, it's engraved. Bell South's name is on there. So it's something I got for a length of service that I got from Bell South. That's not cash or cash equivalent. It's worth less than $1,600. Although it looks like a Rolex, it's not. But it's a gift. I didn't have to pay taxes on it. Since the minister is considered an employee for income tax purposes, but is self-employed for SECA tax purposes, assuming that he hasn't exempted from self-employment tax, if the church pays the 7.65% employer's portion of FICA to the minister, it's considered taxable income to him. I know we, as employers of our ministers, pay them, if they are subject to Social Security tax, we pay them the 7.65 Social Security and Medicare tax, which is what, if they were working for somebody else, that's what the employer would pay for them to be employed there. So we just add it to their income, goes on their W-2, and they report it as income. Remember, the housing allowance is not taxed for income tax purposes, but is subject to SECA tax, self-employment tax, if the minister does not elect exemption from Social Security. If you tried to assign the income, there was a case back in 1940 called Horst. The power to dispose of income is the equivalent of ownership of it. The exercise of that power to procure the payment of income to another is the enjoyment and hence the realization of the income by him who exercises it. So if you can't assign income to somebody else, say, I'm going to preach, but I'm going to let you pay my wife, and therefore I won't have income. No, you're going to have income. Therefore, a minister who holds a meeting but forgoes the income to help a struggling congregation should report on his income tax the income he has foregone, along with a corresponding charitable contribution. A minister who agreed with his eldership that I won't give you contributions, but you just cut my pay, reduce my pay by the amount of the contributions I would make, should recognize the additional income and the corresponding charitable contribution. Now we have a dark side of income. There's something called annulment, especially as it relates to not-for-profit or profit or non-exempt or non-for-profit organizations. Annulment means that money that has been owned, been used by the corporation, the not-for-profit, and if it's given to someone, to an individual, other than as compensation for services they performed, can cause the church to lose their tax-exempt status. I know we had in Cobb County a congregation that bolted their doors, and they had a few $100,000 in cash in the bank, and they were looking for places to give that because they could not, the members of the congregation could not take that money because it would be annulment. It would be them benefiting from the closing of that tax-exempt organization. And that, as an income tax issue, would cause unreasonable compensation if they gave that. And we'll look at a couple of court cases. In the Praise the Lord bankruptcy case, Jim Baker, who was the president of PTL, was reasonably compensated, according to the courts, from $133,000 to $177,000 in compensation from 1984 to 1987. That's what they held was reasonable compensation for him. His actual compensation, including fringe benefits, was in excess of $7.3 million over that 4-year period. So the court held that he was unreasonably compensated and had to repay some of the issues, so that it then became owned by the bankruptcy estate, so that they could use that to pay that back creditors of the bankruptcy estate. So a minister that's paid a percentage of contributions, say, you know, the eldership says, look, we get $5,000 in contributions on an average Sunday. If you'll speak on giving, we'll give you 80% or 50% of the increase. But if you're paid a percentage of contribution, you run the risk of receiving unreasonable compensation if your income exceeds what would be considered average compensation. A finding by the IRS of unreasonable compensation would subject a minister to a 25% excise tax on the excess compensation. So if you go back here to the Jim Baker example, if he was supposed to make 133 as reasonable compensation, and yet he made $1 million some odd for that year, then 25% of that difference, whatever he made versus the 133, would be an excise tax that they would assess on the excess compensation. And if he didn't pay that within a timely period, it could also be subject to a 200% tax under the intermediate sanctions rules. So they can get very ugly very quickly, things, if they start claiming unreasonable compensation for a minister. Also, in addition to the unreasonable compensation issues, the church could lose its tax exempt status. In 1986, the IRS audited Truth Tabernacle for 1983 through 1985. As a result of the audit, they revoked the church's tax exempt status due to unreasonable compensation paid to the minister. And only after a court suit was it reinstated. The church, in this example, the church had actually received less than $20,000 a year in contributions and used all its funds to pay its mortgage and its utilities and repairs. The only compensation the minister received was the free use of an apartment and a vehicle. But the IRS still held that he was given unreasonable compensation. Don't ask me why, I just tell you what happened. Variety Club Tent number 6 Charities had a court case that went to tax court in 1997, where the officers of the charity embezzled money from the charity, but the embezzlement did not constitute inurement because they embezzled the money. It didn't go to them as annulment, as compensation. It was embezzlement. However, if they were renting a building from an officer, then it could constitute annulment if the rental was not reasonable. So that's a little bit there about annulment. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about tax-free fringe benefits. Housing allowance is an income tax-free benefit. It's not a Social Security tax benefit. Gifts, we talked about that. The gifts based on the intent of the donor and based on the regularity with which they're done. Group term life insurance, as long as it's less than $50,000, that group term life insurance. That's tax-free fringe benefit. If the church had a school, Macklin Road used to have an affiliation with West Cobb Christian Academy, shared some of their space, etc. And they would give scholarships to the preacher's children. So the scholarships could be tax-free fringe benefit. And employer-paid health insurance premiums can be a tax-free fringe benefit. A tuition reduction, if instead of giving you a scholarship, they give you a reduced tuition, that can be a tax-free fringe benefit. If they give you lodging that's for their benefit, can be a tax-free fringe benefit. We talked about educational assistance up to $5,250 a year. Now, if they pay more than the $5,250, the $5,250 can be tax exempt. Anything above that they pay would have to be taxed to you and reported on W-2 or 1099 for you. If they provided a child care in the church and they let your children attend non-tuition, non-fee based, attend just they gave you child care, and they did that to all employees of the church on a non-discriminatory basis, that could be a tax-free fringe benefit. And then the final one we talked about already a couple of times, the de minimis fringe benefits, and we'll go a little later. Well, next slide is what is included there. So if they occasionally let you use the copier, or if you print off something that's personal on your church printer and you use a computer that's owned by the church, all that would be de minimis tax-free fringe benefits. If they gave you holiday gifts of non-cash items with a low fair market value, a turkey, a ham, a fruit basket, you know, those sorts of things, those would be considered non-tax, tax-free de minimis fringe benefit. If they provided coffee and they just bought the coffee in bulk and you just made your own and you could drink it whenever you want, or they bought a case of soft drinks and you drink one whenever you want, and they furnish it to all the employees, then that's tax-free fringe benefit, de minimis fringe benefit. If they let you make local phone calls, or today's environment, long distance calls may not be charged anyway, and they may make you make long distance calls and not charge you anything. That's a de minimis fringe benefit. And if you subscribe to personal publications and the church pays for that, then that could be considered a de minimis fringe benefit. If they furnish meals or lodging that are furnished for the benefit of the employer, then that would be de minimis fringe benefits. You could be tax-free. Now, it would not be tax-free for Social Security purposes. So they would have to report that for SICA purposes for the tax-free, as a tax-free fringe benefit. We talked about educational assistance already a couple of times. Limited to $5,250 a year has been that limit for years. Congress may one of these years vote to change that limit, but it's currently that limit. And if they provide dependent care so that you can continue to do your work, they could be a fringe benefit that they provide for you. Other things that can be tax-free: premiums for health insurance for the employees and their families, if they're paid directly to the insurance provider. Now, if they pay you and you pay the insurance provider, they can be tax-free if you provide proof of the payment to the church. Absent you providing proof of the payment, they're taxed to you. And tax-free status depends on the church having a written plan. And we'll talk about what is involved in having a written plan. A written plan must incorporate a recorded commitments in the minutes of the church, a commitment to certain rules and regulations concerning payment, like we only pay once you provide proof of payment, or we only reimburse, or we will pay it under these conditions, not under these conditions, etc. And communication of all those rules to the employees as a definite policy prior to any payment happening. And the plan can be called an accident plan or a health plan or some other similar type name. And it has to be operated on a consistent basis. So if you have an accident plan, if the church provides an accident plan or a health plan for you, certain things that they pay for can be tax exempt to you. But if you're given a 1099 NEC, which is what happens if you're given a 1099, they should give you a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation. Used to be a 1099 MISC, changed in 2020 or 2021 to the NEC, because they want them filed by January 31st every year. And MISCs are filed by February 28th every year. So they started NEC so they could have a requirement they be filed by January 31st. So if they pay you on a 1099 instead of a W-2, you're self-employed, and any health insurance premiums paid by the church are taxable income to you. As such, they should be included in the amount shown on the 1099. Now, we talked about 1099 versus W-2. We also said, in addition to the things here that are stated that they've got a conundrum. Where do you put housing allowance? There's nowhere on the 1099 to put it, to show it's there, to show that you got paid housing allowance. So if they report it in the gross in box 1, you know, we don't know what to do with the housing allowance. If they paid you on a 1099, then you qualify for a deduction on Schedule 1, line 17. That's 2021-2022 rules. Used to be, prior to 2018, it used to be on the front of 1040, but that has changed. So there is such a thing called a church plan. A church plan is a plan maintained for the employees by a church or convention of churches that are exempt from income tax under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And health insurance provided via a church plan would be a non-taxable fringe benefit. We hear people talk about, and we'll talk about a little later on when we cover retirement options, that IRAs or 401ks or 403bs or 457s or things that are in other provisions of the Internal Revenue Code. That's what 403b and 401k and 457 all talking about, is the provision of the Internal Revenue Code. But in the Internal Revenue Code, in addition to all those things, is what the Internal Revenue Code calls a church plan. Can only be set up by some organization that is tax exempt under 501c3, and has to be a written plan maintained by a church for its employees. So you could have a IRA, a 401k, a 403b, whatever, or you could have a church plan. A church plan is exempt from the discrimination rules. And the discrimination rules can be very difficult to get around if you have a 401k or a 403b or something like that. They're not so much in generally the IRA, unless there are a few IRAs they may relate to. But discrimination rules say that the highly compensated individuals cannot benefit excessively from a 401k or 403b or 457 or whatever they're talking about. A church plan, though, is exempt from those discrimination rules, so you don't have to worry about the discrimination rules. And then we get, excuse me. Then we get into various things put in by the Affordable Care Act, which was enacted in 2017. A small employer. There are multiple definitions of small employer, but the Affordable Care Act defines a small employer as one who has less than 25 full-time equivalent employees who earn on average less than $50,000 per year and who pays premiums for health insurance coverage under a qualifying arrangement. So most churches I know of would qualify as a small employer, although they may pay their preachers more than $50,000 a year. But if they wanted to carry health insurance for their preachers, they could do it and be exempt under the exempt from the Affordable Care Act under the small employer definitions. Section 125 of the Internal Revenue Code defines a cafeteria plan. Does the company you work for pay health insurance for you?
They do.
Okay. They probably pay for it under a Section 125 plan. And if they have group life insurance, probably paid under Section 125 plan. There's most companies have Section 125 plans in place. So they cover health and accident and health plans. They cover health savings accounts. They cover adoption credit. They cover dependent care assistance, and they cover group term life insurance. As we've said a couple of times, group term life insurance, even though you may have more than 50,000, it can cover 50,000 tax-free, but the rate they pay is generally cheaper than any rate you can get in the marketplace. And if you have 2 or 3 times your salary and it exceeds that 50,000, you're not paying much coverage. You're paying a very low rate to have the extra coverage there. But the first 50,000 is tax-free. Anything above that is usually at a better rate than what you could get in the marketplace. Okay. Questions? And
not at this time.
I sped through this because when I taught it at PTP, this basically covered an hour and a half. So I just sped through a lot of it, but there's a lot of data here. We will, the last screen is the question screen. In your syllabus, you will note that next week was the fringe benefits discussion.
Right.
Put it in this week so we could go ahead and cover it this week, because it was really talking about what is income to the minister.
Okay.
So it went along well with that, better than it did on the housing allowance issues.
Okay.
So we will not cover that next week. We'll make that change to the syllabus. So I will stop the sharing here and stop the recording.